All right, prep time strategy and content generation. So the first thing I'll go through is what you should do during prep time. You only have 15 to 20 minutes of precious prep time with your partner. So it's really important that you have some sort of game plan as to how you want to approach it. So for the first 2 to 3 minutes, you should individually think about key parts of the debate. And this especially applies to opening government and opening opposition, at least this part of the presentation, in terms of the mechanisms, the main points that you want to introduce, and whatever comes to mind that you think would be important to share with your partner. And then quickly present ideas of any arguments that you came up with your partner at the end of that period. For the next 5 to 6 minutes, you should decide which of those arguments you think are the strongest. And then the first speaker should, and that's what I mean by S1, should write out the basic point in terms of bullet points. So using the structure that we discussed yesterday, you should write out the claim, you should write out any mechanisms or reasons that you can think of to support that claim, any good examples you should write down next to that, and then the list of impacts that follow from that argument. You should list out that skeleton and leave enough space so that you can add in more reasons later if you think of them, or add in more impacts later or more examples. So make sure if you're using paper, don't be afraid to leave spaces and to use as much space as you need. If you're using a computer, obviously you can add mechanisms and add lines and insert them easily. The second speaker should, of course, help come up with these reasons and these impacts, but at the same time, since you'll be speaking second, you should, and your main job will also be to respond to the other team's arguments. You should think of likely arguments that the other team might make and how you might be able to respond to them if they do say them. And in some instances, it's very obvious, like the debate that we did yesterday about legalizing all drugs. It's pretty obvious that opposition is going to talk about how this might lead to more consumption of drugs and more addiction. So you should think of, in prep time, possible responses to that already, such that you have more time to think of good responses and deal with the arguments that are coming from the other side. And then for the remaining of the 5 to 6 minutes for prep time, you should try and write the first speaker's speech in more detail. The second speaker will have more time during the debate, so it's very important, especially for, let's say, the Prime Minister's speech for opening government, that you have your speech well written out. And by well written out, I don't mean you need to write it word for word, and I'll show you towards the end of this lecture what good notes look like. But you should write out the main bullet points in terms of the mechanisms and reasons to support the argument and the impacts. You don't need to write everything down word for word, because that's just going to waste a lot of time. And during your speech, you don't want to have to look at your notes the entire time. You want to be able to project your voice. You want to be able to look at the audience, make eye contact, and do all the other stylistic things that come along with public speaking. So you should use your notes as a reference. And if you can actually practice speaking without notes for a minute or two, then that'll give you the kind of skill to be able to use your notes as a reference, not completely rely on them, such that you can save time by just writing brief bullet points for your notes and use those as a reference to give your speech. And you should add things such as details, examples, impacts at this point, the smaller additions that will just wrap up your speech nicely. So that's what you should do, especially as a top half team where you only really have 15 minutes to prepare. Now I'll go into the bottom half prep timeline. So this is closing government and closing opposition. If you're a bottom half team that's going to be extending off of and adding new arguments to your opening team's case, then it's important to remember that the 15 minutes of prep time aren't the only time that you have. And you should, especially during this camp, try and build some sort of contact with your partner through Discord, through email, whatever works best for you, such that you can discuss during the debate what points you want to discuss. It's really important as an extension speaker and as a whip speaker in a closing half team to update your arguments and make sure that you're on the same page with your partner about what arguments you're going to talk about, because you have to adapt to what happens in the top half debate. So it's very similar in terms of the 15 minutes. You should think about key parts of the debate silently, and then share whatever comes to mind, and then decide which points are more important and write them out. But it's also important to recognize as a bottom half team that you should probably be spending some more time actually coming up with arguments rather than writing out your speech during prep time, just because you have to recognize that a lot of the arguments that you might consider will probably be taken by your opening team. because the most obvious points will be ones that they also come up with. And therefore, you should try and come up with even more arguments and even more reasons and even more impacts, such that when some of them are taken up, you still have other arguments that you can rely on. And there's no point in writing out your speech in a great amount of detail if a big parts of it can change a lot. So be ready to be adaptable and prepare more than you really need. And during the debate, the first speaker who will be presenting the extension and the new arguments should take note of what arguments and analysis have already been said by the opening team, such that they can recognize what they can add that is new to the debate. And then the second speaker should think of areas of clash and track contributions of each team. As I mentioned yesterday, a very effective way for whip speakers to give their speech is by discussing clash points and main themes. So in yesterday's debate, it was themes such as addiction, such as safety of drugs, such as the dangers of drugs, etc. And so when you are a second speaker and you need to go through those main themes of the debate and talk about the debate as a whole, you should keep track of which arguments fit into which themes and which of them clash directly against each other, such that you can resolve those clashes in your speech and give responses to the correct arguments. So make sure you track contributions of each team and clashes. So maybe have a separate page for each team, and then keep track of which arguments each team has added, such that during a speech you can go through and say, look, opening opposition had these 3 arguments, and then give responses to each of them. So that's something that you should do as a whip speaker during the debate for a closing team. Does all of that make sense in terms of the prep timeline and how you can effectively prepare for the debate? Let me know if there's any questions at this point. If not, I'll move on to how you can generate arguments and how you can actually come up with arguments in a way that's effective. So there's 2 main ways I would suggest. Obviously, this is just creative problem solving and you all will have your own techniques, but these are just some guidelines as to how you can get started. So the first thing that you should consider are stakeholders. These are people who are affected or involved in the motion. So it could be individuals or group of people who are the object of the policy being passed, or it could be just actors who will react to the motion, who will be affected by the motion and the way that it changes their incentives, and therefore will change their behaviors and will have an impact on the debate. So for the motion, this House would implement a sugar tax, stakeholders would be just individuals who are buying groceries, but it could also be corporations who manufacture these sugary products and how they might change their policies in response to this particular sugar tax. You should also consider at this point which stakeholders are more important than others, such that you can prioritize certain arguments over others, but also during the debate, if you realize that one argument prioritizes one particular stakeholder on your side, and then the other team is making an argument that prioritizes another stakeholder, then it might be useful to weigh up those 2 stakeholders and say, this argument's more important than their argument because we help a stakeholder that's more important, and then give reasons why that stakeholder might be more important. So if you think of the various groups of people who could be affected by the motion, then you can think about how they're affected by the motion and how their incentives change when the motion is passed, and how their behavior is going to change to lead to a particular impact, and use the sort of step-by-step staircase of analysis that we mentioned yesterday in building from that premise to an end outcome. The second thing that you can think about is the category of impact, and sort of preemptively think about what the clashes of the debate are likely to be. This could be the environmental impact, political impact, social impact, economic impact, cultural impact, but obviously it varies a lot depending on the debate. So for example, the debate yesterday about legalizing drugs, some of the main clashes were about rehabilitation or about drug safety or about addiction. So if you can recognize that that is a main area of clash that's likely to occur in a debate about legalizing drugs, then you can work backwards to think about how might rehabilitation improve if we do legalize drugs, and then think of the mechanisms that could take you from that premise to the impact of rehabilitation, or about drug safety or addiction in turn. If you think about those end impacts and those end themes, then you can work backwards to think about how the policy being passed might either benefit or harm those particular impacts. Any questions about any of that? All right, then I'll move on to how you can track during a debate, which was a question asked yesterday. So the first and most important rule to keep in mind is that you should always do what works best for you. Myself and Arit have worked together, but we have very different styles in terms of how we track during the debate, how we keep track of arguments and responses, and you should always just figure out what works best for you. Some people might use different colors to see whether one particular item is a piece of rebuttal or whether it's an argument. Some people might want to underline or circle, or some people just remember naturally, or it's just the way that they write it, whether they keep an arrow next to it. Whatever works best for you, use shorthand notation or colors or some sort of method to keep track of what's an argument, what has one team said, what has the other team said. Maybe use different sheets of paper, one for rebuttal, one for arguments. It's completely up to you. But the general tips I would say are that when you start of prep time, make it clear for yourself the larger argument under which each subpoint fits. So the structure that we discussed yesterday in terms of recognizing the main claim that encompasses all these sub-reasons and subpoints that you have, that should be something that's very clear in your mind and in the way that you're notating and in the way that you're tracking the debate as to what those main arguments are. And that's important because you should leave space under those big arguments to keep track of points that you've made and then responses that your other team and your opposition have said in response to that, and then the response that you want to give back to that, and then have a way of tracking using colors or using different notation what each of those things signify, such that when you're going through that point, you can say, look, we provided you 3 reasons as to why this argument is true. Their only response was this, but we have 2 responses to that response, and then give those responses in that order. So if you're able to, under that piece of paper, just write down all those things that are important, then you can, during the debate and during your speech, have a very fluent way of covering all of that material in a way that's effective in persuading the judge that your side wins that argument. And so, like I said, you should keep lots of space if you're writing on paper or if you're typing on a computer to just write down whatever your opposition has said or any things that you think of in terms of new impacts or new mechanisms under that larger argument, and make sure that you're categorizing your notes based on that. So, you know, you have one argument on rehabilitation, you have one argument on drug safety, you have one argument on addiction, and you write down all the relevant subpoints when you think of them in those particular categories, such that when you're giving your speech, you don't need to think about, oh, how am I going to structure my speech? Instead, you already have your notes in that order, such that you can just read through your notes in a chronological order without having to worry about the larger structure, because you already have written them in a way that's really easy to read out. And so use whatever works. Use different colors, use different notation, whatever works best to keep track of what's your own argument, what did your opposition say in response, what is your response. Something that I do is write quote marks around what my opposition said, so I know that's something that they said, and then use an arrow to indicate that this is my response to that. That's one way that you could do it. Now, especially if you're a web speaker, tracking is very important because you need to give a holistic overview of the debate, and you need to make sure that you are keeping track of every single argument made by every team. So what this means is that you should use a method of notation that fits to your style. So some whip speakers like to go team by team. They say, firstly, I'll start with responding to opening opposition, then I'll respond to closing opposition, and then I'll respond to opening, and then I'll weigh over why we beat opening government. And so you should keep track of each of those teams on, let's say, a separate piece of paper to just write down what each of those teams said and why your team beats them in terms of giving responses to that. Or you could write it down in terms of clashes. As I mentioned before, you could have a piece of paper for each main theme, and then write down what the opposition said in each of those themes and respond to each of those things in turn. That just completely depends on the kind of style that works for you, whether you'd like to go team by team or whether you'd like to cover the debate in themes. But especially as a whip speaker, tracking during the debate is really important. And you should especially keep these tips in mind when you're about to deliver your speech, such that you can give a structured account of what happened in the debate. Are there any questions about that?